The menstrual cycle on average is about 28 days in the healthy female of reproductive age. Now this is, again, an average. Certainly it is perfectly normal to have a shorter menstrual cycle, sometimes a longer menstrual cycle, and depending on who you are, that may vary from cycle to cycle. The first day of menstrual cycle, day 0, this one right here, also happens to be the last day of the menstrual cycle. So in this particular diagram, you'll note that we have a day 28 and a day 0, and they are actually the same day. It is, in fact, a cycle, thus being exactly the same. Menses means also sometimes called menstruation or period. We have a lot of euphemisms for it. Some of them quite humorous, some of them not so much. But the technical term would be menses or menstruation. That begins on day 0. And it is the day in which the uterine lining, and uterine lining is probably not the best word to use, but the endothelial layer, endometrial layer, I should say, that is rich in blood and mucus, is shed. And so we get the flow of menstrual blood. Again, beginning on day 0. Typical menstrual lengths can be anywhere from just a few days to 7 days. These are all common lengths, but on average it's about 5, as you can see right there. The menstrual cycle includes everything that's happening in the female reproductive cycle, or in the female reproductive tract, including what's going on in the ovaries, what's going on in the uterus, the hormone levels that are present, that are ebbing and flowing. All of that is the menstrual cycle. We can further subdivide the menstrual cycle into the ovarian cycle, focusing on just what's going on in the ovaries, and in the uterine cycle, just what's going on in the uterus, putting them together into the overall cycle. So let's take a look at the ovarian cycle first. And before I move on to the next stage, I also want to talk about the ovarian cycle. The ovarian cycle then is subdivided into essentially 2 phases and 1 essential day. This day right here in the middle, this is the day that you ovulate. So we can call it a phase, ovulation. Then we have the first phase preceding ovulation is the follicular phase, and the second phase is the luteal phase, and we'll go through that and explain that there. Okay, if we look closer at the ovarian cycle, let me kind of zoom in on here. The x-axis is a little bit weird. Not how I would have designed it, but still the same. You can see day 1, which I would call day 0, but nevertheless day 28, and the cycle here. The ovarian cycle begins when FSH, and remember FSH is controlled by the release of GnRH from the hypothalamus. So FSH stimulates the oocyte, and you'll recall that the oocyte is then going to, it's stuck in prophase 1, and now it's going to complete meiosis throughout the ovarian cycle. So that's what's going on with the, it's going to complete meiosis 1, and it's going to begin meiosis 2, and then it's going to get stuck in meiosis 2 at metaphase 2. That's what's happening to the oocyte. But surrounding the oocyte, and we will take a closer look at this, so I'm just going to kind of carefully identify these just really quickly. This layer right here surrounding the oocyte, those are follicular cells. The follicle contains the follicular cells and the oocyte. And in response to FSH and the levels of FSH, let's look at this down at the bottom here. The levels of FSH shown in red here. So let me kind of highlight that for you. Notice it's really reasonably low. It's not huge, but it starts to climb a little bit of ebbing and flowing, a little bit of fluctuation there. And that fluctuation of FSH and these low levels of FSH, and it gets a little higher right before ovulation, this is what stimulates the follicle. We continue to bombard the follicular cells with FSH, the ovaries with FSH, and the follicle develops. During this developmental process, it enlarges and it fills with fluid. Okay, and I am going to go into more details on this in a minute, so bear with me. But here's this fluid here. Okay, and forgive the probably unfortunate analogy, but like a pimple, as this becomes filled and enlarged and swollen, it will reach the point where it's ready to basically explode. Now, the trigger for that explosion, if you will, is actually this other hormone here, this luteinizing hormone, LH. LH is, so let me kind of highlight there. Notice that LH climbs a little bit, and then we get this huge surge in LH, okay? Followed by a rapid decline, and LH levels drop down fairly low. This surge, this gigantic surge right here, known as the LH surge, is responsible for triggering ovulation. Without that LH surge, we don't ovulate. And there are occasions when females will have a menstrual cycle without actually ovulating. That's not all that uncommon. So for women who are trying to get pregnant, so them and their partner, they want to get pregnant, one of the things that they can do is actually track their LH levels, because LH is a great predictor of ovulation. And so when they notice that the LH levels, and there are kits, you can buy them at any drugstore, any CVS or Walgreens or even Walmart or wherever you buy these kits, and the kits will measure LH levels. And when the LH levels are high, you can predict that ovulation is going to occur quickly, or is going to occur within that surge, within just a couple of days of when LH levels begin to spike. If we look at estradiol, okay, estradiol is an estrogen, and there's actually several types of estrogens. There's estrogens that are present during pregnancy, estrogens that are present during ovulation, during the menstrual cycle. Anyway, estradiol climbs also during the follicle phase. And the reason for that is actually the follicle itself. It is the follicular cells as it matures that releases the estrogen, or estradiol to be more specific. And so as these follicular cells grow and develop, they release more and more estrogen. And we can see that as we track this here. With the growing follicle, the estrogen levels also grow. And they peak right here, right before ovulation also. And so many of your kits will track LH and estrogen both. And so you can get different kits focusing on different things. Now, once the follicle has ovulated, once it pops, the oocyte pops out, this is usually on day 14 of the menstrual cycle, or if your menstrual cycle is not 28 days, it could be day 11, and that actually highlights the importance of the LH surge. Is you can't just necessarily say, okay, day 0 is the first day of menses, so we're going to have sex on day 12 and try to time it that way, because you might actually ovulate on a different day depending on whether your cycle is shorter or longer. When the oocyte is released, some of the follicle cells come with it, and you'll remember that because you go up here and you look at the corona radiata. Those are follicular cells, and it comes with the oocyte. You can kind of see them right there, the little red lines that are around that oocyte. But many of the follicular cells actually remain behind. That's the yellow part here. Okay. And what happens is once the oocyte is released, those follicular cells go through this conversion process, And instead of producing large amounts of estrogen, they still produce estrogen, that's important. They also begin to produce progesterone. And at first progesterone production, let's kind of pick a different color here. I don't know if you can highlight in black. Let's give it a try. At first progesterone levels, you can see right here, fairly low. I'm not sure that's really working for me, but we're going to stick with it, fairly low. But then shortly after ovulation, you'll notice that the progesterone levels begin to climb. And they climb and they climb, and this climbing is, this elevation in progesterone levels is consistent with the maturation of what is known as the corpus luteum. And that corpus luteum, its job is to produce progesterone. And it will continue to produce progesterone. And if fertilization has occurred, there's some feedback that occurs from between the uterus and the oocyte that will cause this corpus luteum to keep going, to keep producing progesterone. However, in the absence of that feedback, of that information, the corpus luteum will begin to decay, and you'll notice that as it does, the progesterone levels begin to drop, okay, dropping down. The decaying corpus luteum degenerates into what is called a corpus albicans, not listed here, but we'll look at that in more detail as well. Incidentally, some women struggle with their menstrual cycles with PMS. And the common perception is actually that PMS is due to, you'll hear people say, oh, she's just being hormonal right now. Notice this. Hormone levels are actually fairly low right before you begin to menstruate. So PMS is typically due to a drop in hormone levels, not due to an excessive amount. So kind of an interesting thing to note. Notice the estrogen. I forgot to track that as well, but remember this corpus luteum is going to be producing some estrogen too. And so you'll see that the estrogen levels will drop a little bit following ovulation, but then as that corpus luteum matures, we'll start to produce a little bit more, but then as it decays, we're going to see our estrogen die down a little bit. Okay, so estrogen is actually highest in, well, it's highest right before you ovulate, but relatively high in the latter half of the menstrual cycle. Now let's take a look at the uterine cycle. Now again, starting with day 0, let me kind of highlight where we're at with that. Let's pick a different color here. Stop. And yes, I talk to inanimated objects and tell them to stop, which is very helpful. Anyway, day 0 right here is when well, let's actually go back up here and look at this lovely little uterus diagram right here and talk about the different layers of the uterus. We have a strong outer layer, of course, okay, as shown here, but also if we dive deeper, okay, this portion right here, I will highlight it in blue, this portion right here is what is known as the myometrium, and it is composed of smooth muscle, and that smooth muscle is quite powerful enough to force a baby out of the uterus during childbirth. The inner layer is, what's a good color that'll show up? This layer right here. This is endometrial cells, a type of epithelial tissue. Okay? And during the menstrual cycle, those endometrial cells will go through meiosis like crazy. So we start out, let's go ahead and look at that. We're going to shed those endometrial cells, and then what we're going to do is during the menstrual cycle, after we've shed it, so let's say menstrual cycle lasts for, so maybe we're menses, well, it looks like right here we're going to do 4 days. So we're going to say 4 days. So this particular picture, whoever this is representing, maybe are going to menstruate or have menses for 4 days. At the end of that, what ends up happening is these layers of cells, and I'm going to just draw in some cells just kind of to illustrate my point. Obviously, we'd have a lot more here, but we're left with a small layer of cells here. But in response to the correct hormones, and I'll talk about the hormones in a minute, these cells begin to go through mitosis, and we start to produce more and more cells, and the endometrial layer becomes thicker and thicker and thicker and thicker as we progress through the menstrual cycle. As it thickens, remember angiogenesis? We talked about it with cancer. But these cells begin to release these chemical signals, and those chemical signals stimulate, I'm going to do it in black, but stimulate the development of capillaries, or the growth and development of blood vessels that embed themselves further and further into the endometrial layer, supplying the tissue with the blood that is necessary for this mitosis to occur. Now, the layer of the endometrial cells is quite spongy, and it will continue to develop and thicken. After ovulation, and in this particular diagram, ovulation is going to occur at day 14. So after ovulation, so we'll just draw a nice little line here to represent ovulation, and the development of the corpus luteum, this endometrial layer is now going to become what we call secretory. In that not only is it just proliferating through mitosis, not only is it developing blood vessels, but it's also now secreting various different chemicals that will help support the embryo and facilitate implantation of the embryo should fertilization occurs. It's also going to be secreting mucus and other substances designed to help with the function of the uterus, which in this case, at least at this moment, is to provide a place for an oocyte, should it be fertilized, to embed itself into the endometrial layer, where it can have access to this lovely rich supply of blood and to the nutrients and other substances, other growth factors and so forth that are present within the endometrial layer during the secretory phase. Now let's talk hormones. Here we can see the hormones that are present during ovulation. Importantly, FSH and LH are going to affect the ovaries. But remember what I told you about, let's go back up here. Remember what I told you about the developing follicle releasing estrogen and the developing corpus luteum releasing progesterone and estrogen both? Let's go back down here. Look at the hormones involved in the development of that uterine layer. Estrogen is responsible for what we know as the proliferation stage, which is going to occur essentially right here. This is my proliferation stage. And so estrogen causes this growth, lots of mitosis. So big exclamation place, lots of mitosis and angiogenesis. Put some exclamation points here. And then it's the progesterone that actually causes this endometrial layer to transition into the secretory phase. And that secretory phase, again, super duper important, super duper necessary if we want to be able to succeed at becoming pregnant. And so this layer is supported by the progesterone. Yes, we still get mitosis. Notice it gets thicker. Oops. Got a little carried away there. That's an O. We're still having angiogenesis. That's still happening, and that's thanks to, look, you know, it's not like the estrogen has gone down to zero. okay? But because of this progesterone, which is climbing as my corpus luteum develops, we also are getting our chemicals that are being released, and so we become secretory. And these would include growth factors. I'll just abbreviate it with GF. And that's generic term. It's not the same thing as growth hormone release from the pituitary, but still related. Growth factors are going to help the development of the oocyte should it implant. And other substances designed, including mucus, designed to protect that oocyte and facilitate its transition into a cell that can implant into that uterine lining. In the absence of implantation, hormone levels drop, as you can see. Not only does estrogen and progesterone, estrogen and progesterone drops, but notice that LH is down. Follicle stimulating hormone actually starts to climb because we're now going to start to repeat this process. Okay, we're going to put this all together, going back up here to kind of put it all together into the menstrual cycle, and you can see this entire cycle in its entirety in this picture here, and it's good to study. And you'll notice that my uterine lining is becoming thicker and thicker still due to the estrogen and the progesterone.